2 years ago, the world once more turned its attention to the Israeli Palestinian conflict as new fighting emerged after the October 7th attack. My attention was captured 4 years before that. I began reading books, historical documents, and listening to advocates on both sides present their case, and then thinking through the issues presented therein. I found that this conflict presents many really important questions, and that typically they're very fundamental political philosophy questions that most nations get to take for granted. Today, I want to talk about one of those questions, maybe the most important question: what justifies the existence of a nation? And I particularly want to talk about it in the application of should Israel exist? Gonna aggregate some people. The reason I want to talk about should Israel exist is because many pro-Palestinian arguments boil down to this question. And it is fundamental to the question of how we ought to ultimately resolve the conflict. If Israel shouldn't exist, then any solution to the conflict should include the dissolution of Israel. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free! But if Israel should exist, then Palestine shouldn't claim from the river to the sea. Other borders will have to be chosen. So it is a really fundamental question about the conflict. Now, as a preliminary measure, I'm talking about the justification of the existence of a nation. I'm not asking, does a nation exist? North Korea exists, but it shouldn't. A nation exists if a collection of people claim sovereignty over the land they live in and are able to defend that claim from rivals. It's more of a factual question than a value, moral, or ethical question. I find the value question to be much more interesting. With that out of the way, there are a lot of arguments saying that Israel shouldn't exist. I'm not going to be able to address every single one of them individually, but I think that most arguments can be grouped into two types of arguments. One, Israel was improperly founded, and two, Israel has been evil enough to justify its annihilation. We're going to talk through those two groups of arguments. We're going to focus on the first one. Was Israel improperly founded? One of the most common arguments that I see is that the Palestinian Arabs are the first people of the land of Palestine. They've been living there for thousands of years. They're the indigenous population. And so it is unjustified that Jewish colonists showed up during the 20th century and seized the land. Importantly, this argument isn't true. Palestine became a majority Arab in the 7th century when the Islamic Empire conquered it, although Arabs had lived in it for at least 1,000 years before that. There's a 4th century BC country that ruled over part of Palestine. I haven't found anything to show me what the demographics were like at the time, but you'd expect there to be at least a significant Arab population. On the other hand, Jews have lived in Israel for over 1,000 years before the founding of that kingdom. So there is a strong Jewish claim to have long roots in the region, and there's a strong Arab claim to have long roots in the region, but actually neither people are the first people of Palestine. The first people were the Canaanites. Now, we get that name from the book of Exodus in the Bible that says that the Canaanites were there first, but we have corroborating evidence, we have Greek histories, and we have archaeological evidence, particularly in the form of the skeletons of people who are genomically independent enough from other ancient people to be considered Canaanite. So, if we're adopting this view that Palestine should actually be owned by its first people, by the indigenous population, where are those people now? What happened to the Canaanites? Well, their identity faded away, but the people of Canaan intermixed with at least Jews and Arabs, which we can see through their genome, such that today, many Jews and Arabs have Canaanite ancestry. So this question of who is the first people of Palestine doesn't get us any closer to resolving the problem, because both groups who currently claim it have ancient roots to the first people. So we don't even have to address, is that a compelling argument, because it doesn't answer the question. A different but related argument that I often hear is that Israel is a last remnant of European colonialism. It was created by a European mandate, and European colonialism is evil, so we should get rid of Israel. I say a European mandate because some commentators will claim that Israel was made by the British mandate. Some will claim that it was made by a UN mandate. Either way, the argument is that it's an encroachment of Europe onto Middle Eastern people. I don't find that argument particularly compelling because there are many nations that were created by European mandates, and we don't typically say that they shouldn't exist. Most notably, Israel's next-door neighbor Jordan was created in 1921 as a British protectorate through a League of Nations mandate called the British Mandate for Palestine. And Jordan isn't alone. Lebanon and Iraq were created by mandate. The list of nations created by European mandates go on and on and on. We can certainly say that the boundaries of these nations are strange and that maybe they should be different than they currently are, but the idea that these nations, all of these nations, ought not exist seems untenable to me. But this argument is actually related to an argument that I find much more compelling, that the founding of Israel subverted the will of the Palestinian people, and so Israel was founded without popular sovereignty. The reason I find this to be a more reasonable objection is that I think that a nation is justified by popular sovereignty. If a majority of people in a relevant area agree to be subject to a government, then that government justifiably exists. Now, the term relevant area there is doing a lot of heavy lifting because relevant area and the people will be interrelated in order for us to determine which population we ought to be pulling in order to find what will exists. So let me break that down a little bit more. Imagine that I alone decide that me and my office are succeeding from my nation, America, and that we are becoming one unto myself. Would that be legitimate? Obviously not. My office is too small of an area. I myself cannot define a nation, so that doesn't work. I need a larger area. I need a bigger population, a more reasoned population in order for me to found a new nation. Looking to American history, Texas seceded from Mexico. And then, after a few years of independence, they joined America. Was that succession reasonable? Well, the typical American perspective is that yes, it is. It was reasonable. It was justifiable. They had a insular enough population from Mexico that it was fine for them to choose to secede. Well, what about the U.S. Civil War? The Confederacy, which was about half the nation, decided they wanted to leave. And then the North decided to fight them to say you're not allowed to. Do we think that the South was a relevant area and that when their people decided to leave, that was a legitimate choice, that the government no longer should have bound them? And, well, the typical American answer is no, we don't think that that was a justifiable act of popular sovereignty. We think that they were bound to stay with the nation. But I actually don't see how that's reasonable. Because if about half the country decides to leave, and that's not enough, I'm not sure what percentage of people would be necessary. If the majority of your country decides to leave, I don't think they're seceding. I think they're kicking out the minority at that point. I think that you have to be a minority of a nation in order to secede from it. So, fairly hot take. I think the U.S. Civil War was an imperialist action of the North to force the South to stay with them against popular sovereignty. I think there might have been good reason to do that, but it at least was an overriding of popular sovereignty. I think the South was a large enough region and culturally distinct enough to legitimately express a different popular sovereignty from the North to be a different relevant area. Hopefully you kind of understand what I'm saying. I'm saying that when we're talking about popular sovereignty, where you draw boundaries is difficult. What people groups you decide are and aren't legitimate in determining their own sovereignty is tricky. It doesn't seem like it's as simple as who has the most military might, because once again, it doesn't seem like North Korea should exist. So that's kind of the outline of the problem, that figuring out what is the relevant area and who are the relevant people to be considered for popular sovereignty is a little tricksy. Let's talk about Israel. We're going to wind the clock back to 1946, when Israel doesn't exist and the region is being held by Britain. We're going to be talking about what is today Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. I'm going to call this disputed Palestine. There's lots of different names for this region, and there's lots of disagreements about what we ought to call it. I'm not calling it historic Palestine because that usually includes at least part of Jordan, and we're really not going to be talking about that. So Disputed Palestine is what I'm going to be mentioning. In 1946, in Disputed Palestine, we have two nationalist movements. We have a Jewish movement called Zionism, and we have an Arab movement. The Arab population of Disputed Palestine is about 2/3, and they're headed by the Arab Higher Committee, which is a coalition of Palestinian nationalist groups. So if Disputed Palestine is the relevant area we're going to poll, then we're really looking at one nation under an Arab majority. Britain had previously indicated that they wanted to have two nations in Disputed Palestine, one that was a majority Jewish and one that was a majority Arab. But in 1939, they changed that position in the White Paper of 1939, which said there should actually only be one nation because splitting these people into two nations had proven to be unpracticable, meaning there isn't really a clean, practical way to separate these populations. They're so intermixed. They own concurrent land, and it just wasn't going to work out. What that paper said Britain needed to be comfortable with granting a single nation under an Arab majority rule was a number of concessions to help protect the Jewish population therein. In particular, Britain said that they needed the Arab government to acknowledge that Palestine was a national home for Jews, and Britain defined what they meant by that. They said that a national home for the Jews meant that Jews had a right to exist there. Not all Jews, but some Jews, the Jews who are currently there, and a number who are going to be required to be allowed to immigrate, with the emphasis being that they had a right to stay in Palestine. They weren't merely being suffered to exist by their Arab neighbors. And in acknowledgement of that, they required a commitment from the new government that they would protect all people groups within the country, including Jews and Arabs. The Arab Higher Committee said no. They were not willing to recognize that Palestine was a national home for Jews. They said that that was fundamental to the conflict. They didn't think that the Jews had a right to be there, and this imposition was an infringement upon the Arabs' natural rights. And they further said that they were insulted by the request to promise to protect all communities within the nation because one of those communities was the Jews. For me, that seals the deal on the question of a one-state solution. It was not going to happen. With that rejection, we were either getting two states created by treaty, or we were getting borders established by war. So before it came to war, the UN tried to find a peaceful solution. They tried to find a way to partition the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. One of the things the UN did is it looked at the populations of Jews and Arabs in the subdistricts of Disputed Palestine. They found that the only subdistrict with a majority Jewish population was Jaffa, although there were also significant Jewish populations in Jerusalem and Haifa, which I've never heard pronounced. I am sorry if that's not right. With that information in hand, the UN tried to create these two nations that had a majority Jewish and a majority Arab population. Obviously, the Jewish population would include Jaffa, but the rest of the map is a little bit unintuitive. So, here's a map of what they ultimately proposed. This is actually the second proposal and final proposal. An earlier proposal had accidentally created a Jewish state that was a majority Arab because they hadn't considered the population of a semi-nomadic tribe of Arabs. They thought they were fully nomadic and shouldn't be considered, which is a little bit crazy because their population was over 100,000 people and the Jewish population was supposed to be about 500,000. So that's like a lot. The blue is the proposed area owned by a Jewish state, and the yellow is the proposed land owned by an Arab state. The Jewish state includes Jaffa and goes up to Haifa, but then it goes across and all the way north, and it also goes very far south into Beersheba, which I find particularly odd because looking at that 1946 population map, there's almost no Jews south of Jaffa. So I don't really understand why this land was chosen. And there's also a lot of argument that's been made that this land to the south is really barren desert, and so it's not worth very much. But the fact that so much land was given to the Jewish population, despite the Jewish population of Disputed Palestine being about a third, is a huge part of the conflict. So it seems like a major misstep to me to give them all of this land that apparently isn't useful anyway. But we ought not sit here and debate every detail of the map. What's important is that this map in 1948 was adopted by the UN, and Israel said, okay, Jose, those are our borders. We are a majority Jewish nation. Hooray. And then the Arab Higher Committee, in coalition with several Arab neighbors, said, no, we don't accept that map. And the First War began. That war ended the next year, in 1949, at which point the map had substantially changed. Israel had a lot more territory than it had before, and the population of Israel was substantially different. There was about 1 million Jews and only 150,000 Arabs in Israel. Now, that might sound very strange because before the war, there was a huge Arab population in these areas. What happened? Many Palestinian Arabs fled the region as refugees in anticipation of the war. My preferred book on that catastrophe is The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949, by Benny Morris. Now, Benny Morris is an Israeli professor, but his book is fairly critical of the Israeli position and was groundbreaking in presenting some of the best evidence that Palestinians were forcibly deported. Before then, there was a lot of dispute about whether any Palestinians were deported or if they had all willingly left their homes as refugees, and Benny Morris really puts that debate to bed. He gives strong historical support for the idea that some Palestinians were forced from their homes by the Israeli military. Nonetheless, the ultimate conclusion of his book is that the vast majority of Palestinian refugees became refugees because of the war. They heard that the Israeli army was coming, they heard that there was going to be fighting in their backyard, and they chose to leave. So importantly, the whole burden of the Palestinian refugee crisis can't be put on the head of Israel. It was caused by the war. The reality is every war is caused by more than one party, so there is some responsibility on both sides for that refugee crisis. Either way, the number of refugees is somewhat debated. I've seen numbers as low as 625,000 and numbers as high as 750,000. But if we even take that 750,000 number to be accurate, we add it to the 150,000 Arabs who remained in Israel, we get 900,000 Arabs and 1 million Jews at the end of 1949, meaning Israel still carries popular sovereignty. Now, there are two rebuttals to that idea, that Israel was carrying on popular sovereignty. One is to say what I've kind of already pointed out, which is you could count all of disputed Palestine, at which point there is a majority Arab population, particularly if we also include the Palestinian refugees, which I think is a reasonable position. The other argument I've seen that Israel didn't carry popular sovereignty at either of these points is that much of the Jewish population in the region shouldn't be considered because they were newly arrived immigrants. Most Jewish Israelis were immigrants who'd arrived in the last 2 decades at the time of founding. Ultimately, I can't agree with that position because the vast majority of Jewish immigrants were refugees who came in under the British Mandate, and so I think they were legally present in the region and ought to have been considered. So I think Israel was properly founded. Let's move on to Israel has been evil enough to justify its annihilation. The number of arguments that Israel is evil is huge. You've got the current war in Gaza, you've got the treatment of protesters, you have the blockade of Gaza, you've got the existence of settlements in the West Bank, and the list goes on and on and on. I've been following the conflict closely for 6 years, and I am regularly presented with a new argument that Israel is evil. That being said, the overall argument seems to be that first, Israel is evil, and then, when a nation is sufficiently evil, it ought to be wiped out. A pretty frequent comparison is World War II with Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was incredibly evil, and so it deserved to be destroyed. Surely we all agree. But we didn't exile the Germans, dispersing them throughout the world. We rebuilt Germany. The bad behavior of Nazi Germany didn't deserve annihilation, but reformation. We didn't demand Germany stop existing, only that Germany stop existing as it was. We demanded cultural and governmental change. So even if Israel was as bad as Nazi Germany, that only proves that Israel shouldn't exist as it currently does, not that it shouldn't exist, period. And notably, very few people think Israel should exist as it currently does. The state of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are clearly not permanent. Israel hasn't annexed either, but it has occupied, blockaded, maintained significant military interest in these areas, and something absolutely must change. So I don't think an argument that Israel is evil leads to the conclusion that Israel ought not exist. It could lead you to the conclusion that you don't like Israel, that you don't want to support Israel, that you think that you wish Israel didn't exist, but not that it should stop existing. Only that it should stop existing as it currently is. And so that leads me to the conclusion that Israel should exist. That conclusion might seem a tiny bit premature if you're very familiar with the conflict, because I haven't talked about Zionism in a substantive way. Zionism is the idea that Jews are so regularly persecuted that there needs to be a Jewish state for Jews to retreat to in times of persecution. It is the philosophical backbone upon which Israel was built. It's the call for nationalism that brought Jews to Israel. And so it might seem like it's important whether or not Zionism is true. But typically in these arguments, I don't see people bring this up very often. Sure, anti-Israeli proponents will use it as name-calling. They'll say, oh, you're a Zionist, derisively, but they don't typically substantiate that with a reasoned argument. And importantly, I actually think Zionism is wrong. I certainly agree that Jews are regularly persecuted, and if you want to play the Oppression Olympics, I think the Jews have a good argument for the gold spot. But I'm unconvinced that that means a Jewish state must exist for Jews to avoid persecution. I think you can have classically liberal nations with very low levels of persecution and bias. But importantly, even if Zionism is wrong, as I believe, it's the reason that Jews banded together in a national identity in Israel. The fact is still true that the Israelis banded together. I think a nation is justified by popular sovereignty, not facts and logic. So even if I don't think it's a compelling reason, even if I were a Jew in, well, I guess today, I wouldn't feel called to go to Israel. That doesn't mean that they don't. If a populace bands together for a bad reason, they still have popular sovereignty. So this is on a list of things that I would like to see changed about Israel, but not a reason for Israel to not exist. In particular, I have concerns about Zionism as part of a national identity because the Arab population has a higher reproduction rate within Israel. And so given enough time, Israel is going to be faced with a dilemma in that either they need to abandon Zionism or they need to deal with these Arab Israelis who keep having a lot of children. And I think that getting rid of Zionism is the moral choice, and I don't see any moral way to do the second part. So now that I've made everybody angry by saying Israel should exist, but Zionism is wrong, thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment down below, especially if you can think of an argument that doesn't fit within my two groupings. I would certainly be interested in hearing it. But for now, bye!